Hey guys, you're listening to episode 173 of the Finish Line podcast, where we discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. My name is Keelan, and I'm here with my co-host and brother Cody. Today we have a very special episode for you, and we'll be making one of our biggest announcements since we first launched the podcast 5 years ago. Stay tuned for that. Before we get there, you know this podcast has grown almost exclusively by word of mouth. For those of you who have helped get this message out there to others by sending a link to a friend or sharing on social media, we just want to say thanks. It really makes an impact. If you think this or any of our other conversations are thought-provoking or inspiring, take a moment and share it with someone. We have been blown away at how God has used some of these stories to make a radical impact in the world of generosity and missions, and you can be a link in that chain. All right, let's get to it. All right, well, we are very excited to bring a very special episode today. We are joined by a couple very special guests near and dear to the Finish Line podcast. First, we have David Campaign, financial advisor with Blue Trust, and Matt Mancinelli from Generous Giving. We were going to have Heather Tuninga with us as well, philanthropy consultant, although she had a conflict at the last minute. But the reason these three here are so special to us is because not only have they all been on the podcast alumni, you might say, but they are also part of our Finish Line board of directors. So some of you may not realize that Finish Line Ministries is a registered 501c3, and we have a board of directors that faithfully guides us and keeps us on track throughout everything that we do. So David, Matt, thank you so much for being with us, and we're excited to dive in.
So glad to be here. Excited to be back.
Thank you, Keelan. It's great to be back with you.
Now, for anyone that wants a deeper dive on these guys, you can find David's story back on episode 65, and you can find Heather's story back on episode 70, and Matt's story back on episode 83. For now, why don't you guys just give us a little bit of background? How are you connected to the generosity space, and what has that looked like for you over the years? We often talk about the generosity movement as kind of this ecosystem of lots of different corners and spaces. How has that looked like for you guys in your line of work?
Yeah, I can go first. This is Matt. I think there's been two primary ways I've been connected here in the movement. The first, which is, I would say, I guess, the most fun, although both are great, so no offense to the second one, that comes in a minute, but is as a giver. And that even plays out a couple different ways. I mean, I consider some of my board work where I'm working with other board members, but kind of showing up as a giver. I mean, since I read The Treasure Principle in, 2001 or something, many years ago, I just have loved giving. I mean, before I ever knew there was such a thing as a generosity space or ecosystem, I remember buying cases and cases of that book and giving them away. Like that was my generosity ecosystem and the way that I wanted to spread the message. So all that to say, my wife and I, we just love to give, and that's kind of the most fun way to show up. And then second, which is also a blast, I get to work for another little organization called Generous Giving, and we share the message of biblical generosity in order to grow generous givers, especially among those entrusted with much. And so that primarily happens with lots of retreats every year. And so I get to be in the mix with lots of people some who are already generous, some who are just seeing the lights come on. And we talk about primarily why give. So not so much where or how or any of that, but just get to get people excited about giving. And so, yeah, that's where I'm connected, and it's super fun.
How about you, David?
Yeah, Keelan, for me, this began in earnest about 25 years ago in the generosity space when the Lord called me to join a company called Blue Trust as an advisor. And maybe folks who listen to this podcast might know Ron Blue, along with Larry Burkett, are kind of pioneers in the faith-driven entrepreneur movement of applying biblical wisdom and principles to finances and helping people think biblically, as well as putting the highest degree of technical expertise into their financial planning. So yeah, about 25 years ago for me, that's when the journey began in earnest, I would say, on the generosity piece. And so I just have the blessing and privilege of getting to walk alongside clients who become dear friends in their financial stewardship journey and in their generosity journey. And it is unique for each and every individual and couple. And I love being on this board with Matt with Generous Giving, because personally, one of the things that has catalyzed and increased my wife, Kristen, and I, our own generosity journey, it was doing, gosh, this was probably 15 years ago, doing our first journey of generosity that Generous Giving sponsors. And I can't recommend it enough. It just is a sacred place where I was able to experience that with my wife along with clients. And so I just want to encourage folks that, again, generosity is a journey and we're still on it. And I love that I get to be on it with my wife and with friends and with clients.
How about you, Cody?
Yeah, I'm the newest of this group to this generosity space that we're all journeying alongside each other in. And I think for me, it started as a personal journey from trying to accumulate as much wealth as possible for myself to understanding that was not the only way that you can use money. And Keelan, your invitation and just walking alongside me on this journey started to understand what it means to live generously through releasing some of the resources that I had earmarked for myself. So just like Matt said, my journey really started with becoming a giver and allowing that to transform my heart, which then started to impact other areas of my life. So I'd already been working as a financial advisor, and I had to then reconcile what the Bible says about money and what that means for how I live, but also how I give advice to others. And that has just opened up a door to so many amazing adventures since over the past 5 years, starting with setting a financial finish line, which led to the founding of this ministry, Finish Line Pledge, and a bunch of other really exciting adventures since, like traveling around praying with people from all over the world for the generosity movement itself, and some new stuff that we're going to talk about soon here. And what about you, Keelan?
Yeah, you and I have obviously had a lot of crossover. Spent a lot of the last 5 years doing things side by side. And so a lot of my journey has been as a giver too, a lot of learning by trial and error. But in terms of just kind of what I've been able to see of the generosity space, this podcast really rocked my life a lot, because we have been able to see so many incredible stories of generosity in so many different areas and spheres. And every single one, I feel like a new idea or concept in generosity is opened, and have been able to since then explore and apply a lot of those in my own life and in my family's life. But also, you and I have done some work on the nonprofit side too, which is another kind of vantage point of this generosity space. I know some of you have been on various boards as well. And that's kind of a whole nother dynamic, is seeing things from kind of the implementation or the ministry side. And so that's continued to broaden out the perspective. And I think what's unique about a lot of what we're talking about here is that, you know, what we call the generosity movement or the generosity space actually started pretty compact, and generous giving was right there in the beginning. But since then, it has exploded in many different directions. And I think that is one of the cool things about what we get to explore today, is all these different dimensions of what is really going on out there and how God is moving across many different people and places. Now, considering all these different vantage points that we have with the different areas of the space that we've been involved in, I'm interested to hear, how have you seen God at work through givers and people in different ways?
Yeah. So, Keelan, again, like I said earlier, generosity is a journey, like life is a journey. And I go back to what the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 3:5-9, where he talks about, I planted, Apollos watered, but ultimately it's God who makes things grow. That's been the case for my wife and I personally, and then with clients that I'm working with. It's, you plant a seed, you have a conversation about giving, you share an article or a book on generosity. And Matt mentioned the Treasure Principle by Randy Alcorn earlier. That's one of our favorites. Matt, that's been a book that I've given to clients who may have just been at that point where they're just about tithing or at the tithe, let's say 10% of income, but it's a good start. And then you start going along a little bit further, and it's not always about just the money part, right? It's the giving of our time, talents, treasure, and influence. So it really is a journey, but I want to, Keelan, maybe give you one specific example of one of my clients who I started working with in 2012. He had risen through the ranks in the company he worked for. In these final 6 years of his career, he was the president and CEO, so making a very, very good income, highest income years of his entire career, and stock options and things that just were really accelerating their net worth. And they were giving about 10%. But when I started talking with them and sharing articles in the generosity space, like the Treasure Principle, the God and Money book by John Cortinez and Greg Baumber, that just spurred on conversations. And what's so cool now is that they're giving way beyond 10% and even helping them as he's retired in the last couple of years and gotten these payouts. They're giving 50% to 60% of their adjusted gross income each year away to kingdom causes. And that is exciting for me, just to be able to walk with somebody, with an individual or a couple in that journey. I'm encouraged and inspired, and it makes me, and along with my wife, Kristen, we want to keep growing in our generosity as the Lord certainly can bring more income or assets. Obviously, the more the Lord blesses in that way, you can grow in that generosity journey. But here's another thing I will say to that too, though, is if we're not like, and Jesus says this in Luke 16, I believe, if we're not faithful when we have little, we're not going to be faithful when we have much. So that's always my encouragement. Meet people where they are, encourage them, be on the journey with them. But again, help them when they have little. If they're trustworthy with little, they can be trustworthy with much. And my wife and I feel the same way. And as the Lord's allowed, it's been neat to just be able to, as he's grown our income and our net worth, to be able to just continue giving even more generously.
That's cool. You know, David, I don't know who you're talking about. Obviously, that's intentional and right, but I can almost feel like I know their story. So when I think about the way God's working, like with a pretty high degree of certainty, tell you some other things about the couple who David was just talking about. Like they have more joy than they did when they were spending more on themselves, right? I mean, I get to see that all the time. And I mean, this obviously has seasons. There's more to it than just this, but probably in a healthy spot relationally. Like they get to feel like, oh, we're tight, we're united with each other in this as we give. I think about the spiritual formation pieces of that, of just like, as we give, we are more like Jesus, or God so loved the world that he gave, right? His only son. And so we're being invited into being more like God, more like Jesus as we give. And so it's just fun to hear David share the specific example and say like, oh yeah, I'm seeing that example over and over and over again, all over the place, watching the lights come on and knowing that it's not just that people are giving more, which is amazing, and all the things that money's going out and doing is amazing, but also there's just these internal pieces and being more connected to their purpose. Didn't mention that one, but all those, the purpose, the joy, the relationship, the formation are all there. And it's a lot of good stuff that happens when we get to give.
And Matt, to piggyback on what you're saying, it becomes even more so, wouldn't you agree, when you get to do this in community?
Yeah, absolutely.
You spur one another on. The scriptures talk about that in Hebrews, right? Like, don't give up meeting together, because when you're together, you spur this on in each other.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And a bedrock verse for Blue Trust that has been there from the beginning since 1979 when Ron Blue started our firm and continues today. It's these verses out of 1 Timothy 6, 17 and 19, where the Apostle Paul is talking to his protege, Timothy, And you all are familiar with this, but this just is such a bedrock verse that personally and with our clients helps us keep growing in this space of generosity. And those verses say, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant or conceited or set their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but to put their hope in God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. And then here's the second part of those verses. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works and good deeds, to be generous and ready to share. And that way they store up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of the life that's truly life. And so, Matt, we've definitely seen that in our own personal journey with clients. Again, God doesn't need our money. What he ultimately wants is our hearts, right? And Jesus says this, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And I think, whatever we treasure, our hearts are going to follow that. And if we ultimately treasure Jesus, like you said, Matt, we want to become more like him, and we want to keep growing more in his likeness each and every day.
One of the cool things, just in hearing you guys talk about what you get to see on a regular basis, Matt, coming from the generous giving side, you get to be there at such a formational moment in so many people's journey. I mean, I can't tell you, we're somewhere in the 170s of episodes that we've done on the podcast, and it must be a good third of those mention a journey of generosity or a celebration conference at some point early on as a major step in their journey, like just supercharge where they were to where they launched from there. And you get to see that, all the joy and light turning on for people, everything like you were just talking about. And then David, even in what you were just sharing, also getting to be turning that light on for people in a very personal way, really digging into personal finance, which is very different than kind of the generous giving side, but also digging really deep into the strategy. You're talking about stock options and retirement planning and, wrapping all these details in, but also having this trusted relationship. You've walked with people for years and have built that trust to where you can have these conversations about real numbers, real assets, and real decisions that need to be made. And also doing that in a thoughtful, strategic way that can really add a lot of multipliers on what people are able to actually accomplish. And then Heather, who's not here today, but has spoken so much into this group right here, coming from a philanthropic advising side, really hitting a whole different dynamic of the conversation in where people give, working with clients all the time and trying to really hone their calling, unite families together in their direction of where they're trying to point their giving, and also trying to help people do that thoughtfully so that they don't give in a way that they might later regret for one reason or another, and trying to bring in years of experience and wisdom into some of those decisions, especially as the capacity increases, with those stakes feeling higher and higher. And so all of you get to see such a diverse set of decisions and things that people have to work through. As kind of a follow-up question to that, I'm interested, and Cody, interested for you as well. What are the questions you see people bring most often, just among the givers, whether in a work context or just friends and people that you know? What are the kind of questions that you see people wrestling with most often?
Well, appropriate for the Finish Line podcast, but I think how much is enough? I mean, I see that. And the interesting thing about that question is it's asked all along the journey. Like from the first time someone's exposed to the message, I feel like they can ask that almost defensively, but in a reasonable way. Like, aren't I giving enough already? You know what I mean? It starts with like, isn't that enough? To, as you continue on in your journey, like it starts to shift. Like, do I have enough already? Can I give more? So I don't know. That's the first question that came to mind for me as one of the biggies.
Yeah, I think some of the largest obstacles to living generously are fear and greed. And these are both actually addressed by answering that question, how much is enough? And that might be how much is enough to spend, how much is enough to save, or how much is enough to give. Like you were saying, I think at some level we've all wrestled with all of these questions. And I think there's a transition that happens as you step in and you start taking more risks and growing personally and with your family and with your community in generosity. And I've heard this question asked in a couple different forms, but it continues to challenge me to this day. And the question is, why shouldn't I give this? And you can literally audit things that you own and go, is there a legitimate reason why I shouldn't give this? And sometimes the answer is yes. Like, you're going to need that soon. Maybe hang on to that. But it's such a helpful question because I just look through my house and there's stuff that I accumulate and it has sentimental value, but it's not really doing anything for my life. If anything, it adds some level of anxiousness to just have to care for all of these things that I don't actually want or need. And to be able to release that it brings me freedom and peace. And when I get to see other people experience that to a greater degree, because they are both recognizing and overcoming fear and greed in their own lives, that really compels me to want to search myself deeper. Just because we've been giving for a long time doesn't mean we're immune to these things. So it's an ongoing daily walk that we are all, locking arms in.
Cody, I would just add on to that too. Again, John Cortines and Greg Baumer's God and Money book just catalyzed some stuff for my wife and I, and I've been sharing it with clients and friends ever since. But kind of the questions they pose in that book, like a faithful reading of scripture leads not to the question of how much should I give, like we're talking about here, but rather it leads to the question, how much do I really need to keep? And Cody, you were just talking on that. And that's where, I think some people can think, oh, this idea of a spending finish line or a wealth accumulation finish line, it's constrictive, it's restrictive, right? And it's a journey, but it's also the idea that they share in the book of like, we can kind of, each of us go to 3 money mindsets, kind of, right? The spender, the saver, and the servant. And they mention that like the spender, that is a lot of people in the Western world that, someone who pursues the greatest possible consumption, even if they know they should save some. And then you've got the opposite side, the saver side that, they strive to limit consumption and just want to build a pile of wealth. But then the servant, I love the servant, possesses the rarest mindset of all. They orient life around both limiting consumption to an extent, right? God does give us things to enjoy, and we should enjoy those things, right? And limits wealth building to an extent so that we can instead be focused on giving the most of our, time, talent, and treasure toward blessing other people. So I do feel like those are great questions of it flips it on its head of like, instead of, all right, how much do I need to give to be good with God, right? Versus like, no, how much do I really need to keep? Because at the end of the day, back to the treasure principle, right, Matt? We can't take any of this stuff with us, but we can send it on ahead. And that's the point of Randy's treasure principle book.
Actually, I love what you said, Matt, that some of these questions are wrestled with at every stage in the journey. And it's like you keep coming back almost like a spiral on a deeper and deeper level each time. And you think, you're like, I've answered this question already. Why are we here again? And I'm like rethinking everything that I, had already processed through. But isn't that just like the journey of faith in general, right? Just this constant spiral deeper and deeper and deeper. But, once somebody has really kind of thought through how much to give, and you actually start to see some resources accumulating and, trying to then figure out what's next. I think some of the other questions that come to mind for me are, where should I be directing some of this? That can look very different. There's probably 1 or 2 things that come to mind immediately when you think of that. But then if you really think about it, there's a lot of different, very different places that you could direct that to. And also, after you've been giving consistently, especially to the same places for some time, the question, is this actually doing anything, starts to come up often for, I think, givers along the way at some point. And some of these questions can really take a lot of wrestling with. And there's lots of people out there to help wrestle through some of those questions. You guys help givers wrestle through a number of those questions. Heather, in her work, helps people wrestle with some of these questions as well. But there's constantly questions coming up on the journey.
Mm-hmm.
As we've been talking about what you get to see in other givers. I'm curious about what have been some of the most difficult lessons or hurdles that you or you and your spouse have had to work through in the course of your own generosity journeys?
Yeah, it's almost difficult to admit this, but if I'm really honest, even giving can become something that we leverage for our own selfish reasons, and we want to be seen as generous by others, and we're actually motivated to be celebrated by other people, and I've seen so many people model the opposite of that. They're really seeking to glorify the Lord and just increase their Christ likeness through their giving. But there are times when I feel like I can't give enough because I don't have the resources, or if only I had more, then I could do more. And it always brings it back to me at the center. And I have to fight against that. And I have to recognize that there's a deep relational aspect in many different senses of the word. It's my relationship with God. It's my relationship with my wife as we give together and manage resources together. It's my relationship to people that might benefit from whatever giving that I'm able to do, whether financial or otherwise. And it's also my relationship to the places that I'm in, the environments, the geographic locations where I live. The way that I live impacts so many different relationships. And so if I feel like I'm not doing enough, sometimes that's because I'm still viewing the world with me at the center of it. And that has been a hard lesson to identify and then start to unwind in how I give.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that, Cody. I'll jump off that first part especially. Yeah. One of my strengths finder, of course, some of y'all are familiar with that. Top 5 strengths is called significance, which says in it, I want to be viewed as important in the eyes of others. And so I view that actually as my anti-strength, I tend to call it, even though it's kind of at my core. It's like, I want y'all to think I'm a big deal. So what's interesting is in the sandbox I play in at Generous Giving, like the coolest people are the generous people, right? And so it's like, to what you were just saying there, Cody, it's like there's worlds in which you're quote unquote cool. Here I am, I'm reverting to my junior high self when I just wanted to be able to throw a football far to be cool. Nowadays, like there's worlds in which it's, the bigger house or the faster cars to make it cool. But in the generous giving world, some of it is how much you're like being generous is cool. And so I relate to what you were just saying there, Cody, where it's like that part of me that wants to be seen as significant. It's like, I can give a lot of money away, but there's some of that is great. It's the way God made me and to give, but also some of it is this like, yeah, I want y'all to think I'm generous. So there's an interesting wrestle, and it's just a tension to be managed, right? Like all I can do is trust God with that. I'm thinking this year I'm going to try to do some secret giving, which will be very difficult for me to try to also do some of that formative process. But anyway, that's a big one. The other lesson I would mention quickly is trust. Just that God is more trustworthy with my financial world than I am. And I feel like I like to manage things. I tend to be like back in the day when you had a limited number of cell phone minutes. Do you guys remember that? Like everybody, when they went over their cell phone plan, would give me their phone bill to call to get their bill lowered. Like I'm just got this, like, I'm going to do my thing to make things work, to save money, to whatever. And I think the other lesson that is one that I have learned scores of times and feel like I will continue to learn it is like, trust God with what he wants me to have, what he wants me to do, what he wants me to give, instead of trying to control it so much myself.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off both of you guys a little bit too. I think there's the 3 universal longings for every human being, that we long for significance, security, and belonging. And you guys each touched on those. And it's interesting with the pride and the ego side of ourselves, right? Where it can be so easy, Cody, like you were saying, it's just like, hey, look at me, I'm giving, right? Or Matt, like it can be that, hey, I'm so generous, I'm the winner of the football team in the generosity space. And that's just so me, self-centered and not others focused and really kingdom focused. And I'll wrestle with that too, of just wanting kind of that recognition in the flesh, kind of piece. The other thing too, I would say definitely for married couples, husbands and wives, working through this, it's the importance of communication and working through it. And if there's not unity around not just the giving decisions, but how much should we be saving? How much should we actually be spending and using and enjoying with our family? Those just need to be continuous conversations. And when I have not always been as forthcoming in my communication, like, hey, we're just going to give this, and I haven't communicated with my wife, that doesn't go over well. I do not advise that. But when we talk about it in advance and we work through it, and it might be I have a higher number than she does sometimes, and vice versa. But wow, the communication piece is so critical. And back to the Journey of Generosity retreat that we did, I think 15 years ago now, Matt, that you lead and facilitate, like that helped Kristen and I tremendously in our conversations around how do we steward this. Giving, of course, is important, but also the savings piece and the spending piece. But we need to also find those times, especially for married couples, to just get away from the hectic daily pace of life. And that's what I think Journeys of Generosity are so good at doing. It just pulls you away from the different usual routine and schedule. And I love it when the jogs I've done, I've been able to do in beautiful places on a waterfront property, where you feel like you're in just a different mindset. And my friend Mark Batterson talks about this in one of his books, of this idea of a change of pace and a change of place will give you a change of perspective. So whether that is getting away a couple hours away to a Journey of Generosity or just carving out space, I would just encourage listeners in that piece, especially for married couples, because unity is so important. And you don't want to have resentment building between spouses, even when it's a good intention for giving.
Yeah, I resonate a lot with that. And that kind of unity and communication that you're talking about has been one of those spirals in my own journey where I feel like I keep learning the same lessons over and over, hopefully on deeper levels each time. But, it's funny, especially when you're kind of engaged more formally in the generosity space, like we are through the podcast, each of you are in various ways. It takes some effort to be on the same page. It doesn't just happen by default. And I have to keep learning that. And I think that each time my wife, Allison, and I have been able to kind of hone in another layer of, really appreciating the way that God speaks to each of us and how he is going to direct what we do together by giving each of us like one half of the of the plan, and putting that together. And I look forward to continuing to grow in that and have learned so much from many people who have shared deep journeys on the podcast. In terms of other lessons that come to mind, early on in one of our very first kind of really significant giving tests of faith, I guess, when we were first married right out of college, we had a modest shared income and we started giving somewhat substantially for where we were at in that season to one ministry for a couple years, but it was like a decent chunk of what we were able to give. And a number of years later, our season of life was a little different, but it started to come into the news that there were a lot of issues going on in the background with that ministry and real questions about whether anything was actually accomplished with what we had given in that season, which was almost all of our giving outside of the church. And, that caused us to really kind of think about any future giving that we were doing. I'm like, all right, how do we do this well? And I think, people come up to that experience from time to time. And I've heard people say, I am never giving again, or I'm going to be very hesitant about giving again because of a burn like that, which makes me sad to hear because that is not how I feel. But that is a hard lesson to learn. And then the last one that comes to mind is actually very recent. Last year, we were kind of figuring out how our finances were going to play out at the end of the year and made some final giving decisions. And then right into the new year, this year, I realized that I had made a somewhat significant accounting error in our personal finances. And we had given actually a decent amount beyond what we probably would have planned to give. And I am a pretty detail-oriented person, don't make a lot of those kind of errors. And so it really kind of threw us into a little bit of a tailspin for like the first whole half of the year of like kind of trying to financially recover in a little bit. But also, I had kind of gotten to a point where I was like, we've been living with a finish line for a while, and I don't need the spikes of like surplus and like, hey, we can splurge now or whatever. But I kind of expected that God would never let us dip as long as we were, had committed to this, like we're going to never go above this. And that really kind of came into question a lot of this year of like whether we would actually just have enough for like our normal family spending. And it forced me to kind of re-trust God again. And I was thinking about this with what you were saying, Matt, but just having to really trust God, and that my security is not in how our financial decisions, our security is in God. And I feel like it was actually now, after many months of processing, I feel like that season was a huge gift that God could have easily let us start trusting ourselves in that season, but he shook up our world a little bit so that we would trust him. But I love these kind of conversations because God is constantly at work challenging us and stretching us in different ways. And even in just what you guys are sharing here, this looks so different for each of us.
Mm-hmm. Keelan, I wanted to add on to what you're saying. I think so many of us, what we really want is just like, can we just kind of check it off and be done with it for a while, for a month, for a year? And that's not the way it works, right? Like Jesus says, take up your cross daily and follow me. Give us this day our daily bread, this day. Kind of that concept of, Lord, teach me to number my days that I may gain a heart of wisdom. So like living daily, that's something I keep putting in my mind in the forefront, which, Cody and I are financial planners. We help people plan for the future and we do it in our own things. But the thing that we got to watch out for is, reminding ourselves that, hey, it's good to plan, right? But Proverbs 16:9 says, in a heart, a person plans, but the Lord ultimately guides their steps. And that always to me is the caveat. Lord, remind me of that. Remind me of this daily. Remind my wife of this daily. And again, plan for these things, but don't get too far ahead of yourselves.
Now, over the past several years, we have had the privilege to talk to hundreds of givers, and each giver has a unique story. They've taken their own steps, they're growing in their own faith journey, and they have shared so much wisdom with us. But we have noticed some patterns emerge from hearing all of those stories over the years. But what stood out is not that all these stories started to sound the same, but instead that even though people had very different stories, there were some noticeable similarities in the lessons that they were learning along the way. And to show what I'm talking about, it'd be fun to do a little experiment here with this group with one of the first areas that we start to notice these patterns emerging. So my question for each of you is, if you had to narrow it down, what is the one thing that makes you most excited about giving?
So for me, when I see a person where I think giving to them at this moment has the chance to, a person or an organization, like has the chance to make some kind of a swing. So like we've got somebody, she just told us that today's the 4-month anniversary of her living in our house with us. Somebody who needed a spot to stay through all kinds of circumstances. Like, okay, for this season, that's going to be a huge deal for this person. There's a couple in ministry that we've been walking with. They actually asked us my wife and I, to be their mentors in a few things, but we just recently got to give them a bedroom set, a king bed, and some dressers. And there just have been, we didn't know this. They'd been sleeping on the bed that came with their house, which I actually thought was a little gross. Anyway, it was just so fun after that. They're like, oh yeah, we need to get a comforter. And so we went to Costco and got a king comforter. It was just like I don't know, when I feel like when I can see like need might even be strong, but the opportunity to like see the chance to bless somebody, that's when I'm just fired up. Like if I could encounter someone every week who needs a boost in their faith or a boost in their finance or something and come alongside them, that's where I get most fired up to give.
Yeah, if I had to narrow it down, the one thing that makes me most excited to give is, did that giving bring someone I gave to, whether through an organization or a person or a group of people, did it bring them closer to Jesus? And here, I'm going to give you a practical example of this. So one of our favorite ministries that my wife and I have gotten very plugged in with over the last 8 years is the Museum of the Bible. It's in Washington, D.C. I grew up in the D.C. area. My dad was a pastor there. My parents have both passed on. They're on the other side of eternity. And it means a lot because it's in D.C. And I have very fond memories of my mom taking me and my sister and family and friends around the museums and the memorials of D.C. So when the museum was being launched there, I was so excited. First of all, the mission of it is inviting all people to engage with the transformative power of God's word. And if any of you have been there, highly recommend it. If you haven't been there, you need to go. It's one of my favorite places there. But what I love to do with our giving to the museum, we're able to bless others with complimentary tickets to go experience God's word there when they're coming through DC. So I just wanted to share, I pulled this out because this to me is the crux of it. So I had gotten some tickets for one of my clients who's a teacher at a small Christian school in the area, and she was able to take several moms and their students to the Museum of the Bible. This was about a year ago. So she sent me this nice note, a picture of them at the museum, and each of the students had written notes. But here's what my client and friend said. She said, "Dear David, what a blessing it was to be able to take my students and their moms to the Museum of the Bible this year. I'm grateful for you and want you to know how much it meant to us. The trip was another way to help point the students and me to Jesus. Thank you for your generosity and good advice on where to park and which exhibits to go to first. We had a wonderful time and we will always remember it." That to me that's it. And that's just one example. But if my giving or my wife and our giving can bring a person, a group of people closer to Jesus, to know the God who loves them and has created them for great things for his glory, and bringing them more of a deepening relationship with the Lord, I mean, that excites me.
Yeah, I think for me, a couple things come to mind. I'm a physician now, but before that, I was an engineer, and I actually think the engineer never left in me. And so I'm often thinking kind of systematically through things. And early on in our giving journey, I guess partially related to some of that experience I shared before, but even aside from that, I have always been drawn to knowing that we are having a meaningful, tangible impact in some form in the world. That if we're only going to ever have X dollars to give, then I want to know that we're accomplishing as much as we can with that. And that's not the only measure of giving, but it's always been motivating to me. And if I know that, like, in this season, we have this amount to give, and by doing it this way, we can affect thousands of people, that really encourages me and just makes me excited for what we get to be a part of. And in recent years has probably even been the most powerful motivator for me. Is I feel like generosity is one of the deepest tools of faith, of growing in faith. And this is like what I was sharing about how God really turned our world upside down over this past year. But I feel more and more every year that generosity is one of the strongest means by which God enables me to actually trust him, that with each step that I take, and especially that me and my wife take together, that he always responds. And even this year where I felt like everything went wrong, now that the dust is all settled, I'm grateful for that. And we actually are almost kind of putting ourselves intentionally back in the same situation, because I want to trust God now. I don't want to trust us. And so I feel like generosity and giving, and I think through all these different steps along the way, each one has allowed us to just engage on a deeper level. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface, and that, I'm excited to see where he can take us in the next few years. So that's probably the most powerful motivator for me these days.
Love that.
Yeah, and for me, I would definitely say it's the partnerships, the relationships that I've formed through giving with other givers. And I've really taken this into consideration. And when I give to a ministry, I don't think of it as like I have money and you need money. I think of it as like we're giving together because we want to see something happen. We want to step into some kind of invitation that God's extending us collectively. And I happen to have financial resources, and you as a ministry have a great strategy and time and focus on this same mission. And we are now giving together. And that was my way of entering into that. But that's just the beginning. From there, you get to form really meaningful relationships with the people that you give alongside. And that keeps me going. And I'm always looking for, I honestly believe that everyone has something to give. And it's not even to create a sense of like obligation so much as this is such an easy exchange of something that I have in my hands for the joy that comes from sharing it with other people. And I love doing that together with people. And just, thinking through my own experience, Keelan, you invited me to set a finish line, and I got to do that with you. You walked me through that journey. And David, I remember I had a friend visiting from South Africa, and I said, "Hey, David, my friend really wants to go visit the Museum of the Bible. Do you think you could give some tickets to him and his family?" And you sent them tickets, and they got to go see the Museum of the Bible, which brought you joy. I got to participate in that. And Matt, we've been able to have the shared experience of facilitating journeys of generosity and talking about how those have gone. And I feel connected to each one of you because we give together. And ultimately, it's to see God's name alone be glorified. So that's what really keeps me going. But we've asked some version of this question. What is your favorite part about giving? What keeps you going? What brings you joy in giving? To tons of givers. And we've started to see these patterns because each of us highlighted different aspects of generosity in our answers. But there are really 6 main profiles that seem to come back again and again as we hear responses. And we call these giving motivations. And these motivations are usually the first area where givers start to recognize these patterns that I was talking about earlier. And so those 6 motivations are relational givers who give to build connection. And that's what I was really touching on in my response. And for these givers, for relational givers, generosity is about collaboration, community, and shared mission. And then we have joyful givers, which Matt, I really heard you express the joy of giving and seeing how meaningful it is to the people that you get to give to. But joyful givers give because it brings them life. They see generosity as a celebration, and it's contagious. And then we have faithful stewards who give to grow in their own intimacy with God. Their generosity is rooted in obedience, in trust, and in surrender. Then we have compassion givers who give to step into suffering that they become aware of. These givers are moved by a connection to the hurting, and they're drawn to respond. We have impact givers. Keelan, you really touched on this, that you want to see that there is impact as a result of the giving that you're stepping into. Impact givers give to make a meaningful difference, and they think in high yield outcomes and long-term change. It's very strategic in nature. And then we have our strategists who give to multiply resources. David, you do this naturally as a financial planner. You are helping people make the most out of their giving in every sense of the word. And strategists look for leverage. They ask how the mechanics of moving resources can be maximized.
And what's interesting about these motivations is that each one has strengths. Also, each one has some potential blind spots if it's explored in isolation. And even in just hearing what each of you shared, you can hear multiple of these motivations kind of breaking through the surface in some of the experiences you've walked through and what really energizes you. And I think that's true of all of us. But as helpful as motivation is to explore and understand, it turns out I think it's just one part of a much bigger picture. Over time, we've started to see generosity as less of a single path and more as a wide landscape. And hosting the podcast has really helped to kind of broaden that perspective. Every giver's journey is unique, different stories, different seasons, different callings. But we've kept noticing that many of those journeys cross the same kinds of territory, even if they take very different ways of getting there. And out of these conversations has emerged what we now call applied generosity, a way of showing the full landscape of the generous life. It's a map shaped by the well-worn paths of many givers who have gone before and meant to help people see what's possible. And as we've mapped those journeys, we began to realize 7 distinct territories that almost every giver engages with at some point along the way. For each giver, there may be some territories that have been explored in great depth, while others may have been off the radar for years. I know that's been true in my life, and I'm sure in each of your lives as well, but they're all part of the same landscape. And those territories, as far as we can best understand, are motivation, which is the primary driver of your generosity. That's a lot of what we were just talking about here. Second is domain. What are the core focus areas of your generosity? Third is intervention. How do you meaningfully engage with needs in the world? Fourth is allocation. How much do you give and how much do you keep? We've talked quite a lot about that in this episode already. Fifth is flow. How and when do your resources move outwards? Sixth is investing. How do you generously steward the resources you keep? And finally, mobilization. How do you invite others into generosity?
So applied generosity is not about what steps that you're supposed to take. It's not a process to follow, but instead it's about how God forms us as we walk through these different territories throughout time. The goal is not to explore everything at once or even to master everything, but instead to have a clearer sense of the whole landscape so that we can best determine where the next right step might be for us. As you hear the descriptions of these territories, I'm curious which of these feels like familiar ground for you right now, and which of these feels like a territory you haven't spent as much time in yet.
Well, guys, I would say none of these are unfamiliar, right? I've been in the space long enough that I've thought about all of them. And yet, if I thought of the question a little differently, like which of these do you need to think about and grow in? My answer is super clearly every single one of them. And I don't just I'm not trying to be self-deprecating even or sound humble or anything like that. It's like, no, when I look at every one of those, that's real. I think the one that's the freshest for me right now, I heard a fantastic message in October or maybe the beginning of November about the parable of the talents and about the person who gave the message. This is really a parable about risk and about getting things in the game. And the majority of my life and my net worth, really basically all of it, is in 2 places: our house and our 401k that has been largely automatically saved over time. And our house, it feels like to me, is in play now. Like we've got somebody, like I mentioned, living with us, and that's been quite a thing. And then our 401k, it's kind of like, oh, that's just meant to sit there for the next 40 years. And that may be the reality. I'm not sure. But I would say the last 2 months or so, I've really been asking that question, like, is there a way to get that in play? And then I started talking to people who are doing impact investing, and tons of them are like, we haven't seen a lot of return yet. I'm like, okay, that could be like, this is my retirement feasibly. But anyway, that area of investing is, I guess, the freshest, the place I've spent the least time over time, and the thing that right now I'm quite curious about. But every one of these, again, are like, some of them I've had lots of growth in, others less, but there's often another layer that comes, and I'm feeling that as I look at all of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm feeling similar to Matt, doing this long enough, Cody and Keelan, but I love how you've mapped these out in motivation, domain, intervention, allocation, flow, investing, and mobilization. So really looking forward to these resources, because even though I've been in this space a while, I need to keep learning and growing. And kind of like Matt said, yeah, been doing parts of these at different times, but I would say out of those, maybe the domain one right now is one that I just want to dig into a little bit more with myself and my wife personally, but also with clients, and really helping them to laser focus some more, like what truly are the core focus areas of your generosity, right? Because like Cody, you and I as financial planners, we're in the space pretty regularly. How much do you give and keep? And we're doing more with faith-driven investing. And so that's an area of growth actually that's happened more recently with the faith-driven movement and kind of the investing piece as well. And then when do you move those resources outwards? But yeah, there's unlimited things to give to, right? And there's so much need in the world, but none of us individually can do everything, right? And I think sometimes I feel that tension, and it's a good tension. Matt, you touched on tension earlier of like, there's so many things I want to do and give to, but like, what's the Lord calling us to do right now? And that can change over time, or some of those ministries can be ones you give to all of your lifetime. But overarching all these, I do feel like, hey, Lord, what and how can we leverage? I really like this word leveraging the currency of that which is passing away, which are our riches. Like Matt, like you said, our 401k, our savings, those are riches, right? They're passing away. How can we leverage those into the currency of that which will endure forever? And that's this area of true riches that 1 Timothy 6:17-19 talks about. And yeah, really, I've kind of encapsulized what are true riches, right? And I've come down to these 6 things. I think true riches are the ability for us to recognize and enjoy God's blessings in our lives, number 1. Number 2, to love and to be loved. Number 3, to live with meaningful purpose. Number 4, to cultivate healthy relationships. Number 5, to practice generosity and wise stewardship. And number 6, to embrace contentment. So in these in these territories that you have laid out, overarching those, I think about leverage, what I just shared, and pursuing true riches instead of just pursuing riches.
Yeah, I love that. As I'm just kind of looking through these, the one that comes to mind most for me right now, and honestly that changes month to month, but is probably mobilization, which is funny, as the host of a generosity-focused podcast. But, as I think about different layers of mobilization, I think it's easy actually, and maybe there's many in the generosity space who would even say the same, to be very intentional on kind of a big picture level, like directing people you don't even know in stretching and generosity, but to not feel like you have all that level of understanding where it's actually closest to home. And where I think most is, like I shared earlier, is really having a united front that honors my wife and me and the different ways that God works in both of us, and actually seeing that kind of beautifully spun together into a whole new type of generosity that God might do through us. He's definitely stretched us a lot in that over the years, but I think there's so much more even to explore it. And I'm excited to see what he does in that. And I also think about how I introduce my 4 girls to generosity. And, we've gotten lots of good ideas on the podcast, but I just know that there's more out there, and I really want them to experience what's taken me a long time to learn. So I'm constantly trying to figure out how to best convey that to them in a way that they can understand at their current ages.
Yeah, for me, a couple of them, like David mentioned, are just kind of the course of the day-to-day, like the more strategic ones about how to give in a way that utilizes tax deductions, the strategic side of it, investing, allocation, how much do you give and how much do you keep. But I think the one that has been kind of an oversight for me throughout my journey is intervention, is if we're clear about where we're stepping into any kind of need in the world, how do we actually partner with others to do that well? And I have largely outsourced this to people who spend their entire lives focused on this, because it just has not been something that I feel very equipped to step into. I always feel like someone else has the strategy, and I want to help encourage other people to partner with them. And when I really think about it, I think there's so much to be gained from forming a philosophy about what you're giving to. So if God's inviting you into something, how do we love him with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength? Not just in a way that makes us feel good, not just in a way that's fun, not just in a way that demonstrates our own surrender, but a way that's actually making a difference. And I think it's easy to say, well, I did my part. I gave, and the rest is up to God or whoever I gave my money to. But I think there's something missing if I don't actually follow that gift and step into that relationship and say, how can we do more together than you or I could on our own?
Cody, just to piggyback on what you're saying, and I think I shared this in my Finish Line podcast episode with you. So similar to Cody, I love the relational giver piece of that. Motivates me so much, of being part of ministries in a community where you're collaborating together in a shared mission. Like, another example for me is Hope International, who we've given to for a long time, but I finally was able to go on a vision trip with Hope International, El Salvador, in June of this past year. And it's just changed my whole perspective. I'd never been to a third world country, but getting to actually meet and visit where your money is helping equip them and knowing Jesus and saving, and they do Christ-centered microfinance and do great work there, that amped up more of my engagement in Hope International, even though we've been giving to them for 10 plus years. And the other thing I wanted to add too is we've been talking about giving, right? And so much of it is, giving to ministries that God has laid on our heart. But we've heard this on other podcast interviews, the importance of, and my wife's very much into this as well, giving where there's no tax deduction, right, Cody? Where you're just helping, it can just even be a stranger, and you're just helping others where there's no tax deduction for it. And in God's economy, that kind of giving and generosity is just as important in the giving that we do to ministries that are qualified 501c3s that we get a tax deduction for. Because I'll admit, like, when you're a financial planner like Cody and I are, I mean, the tax deduction is nice and our clients like that too. But if that becomes the motivation, the primary motivation, I need to check in my spirit for that too, even personally and with clients. Any thoughts that you guys have on that? Because that's, yes, we want to give through these ministries and there's that shared vision. And yes, there's a tax deduction for it, but also the kind of giving where there's no tax deduction for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the beauties of all of this diversity in the generosity space is that, you just look through the Bible, the expressions of generosity are so, unique, even in what's in scripture. You broaden that to like what givers are doing today, and it's enormous. Every generosity journey is unique. There's, just thinking of the people listening right now, different stories, different resources, different callings, different seasons of life. And at the same time, I think we're all sharing the same landscape of this, generous life that's available. Applied generosity is simply naming that shared landscape. It's providing some definition to it so that we can continue seeing that whole picture and figuring out where that next step is in our own journey.
Well, we are super excited to announce here that over the past year, we have been building out these applied generosity resources. And the first of those that is live right now is the Applied Generosity Podcast. You can go find it wherever you listen to podcasts. And this is really meant to map out the generous life that we've been talking about.
Yeah, when I think about the Finish Line podcast, the first word that comes to mind for me is story. You're hearing story after story about people's lived experience, what generosity has looked like for them, what highs and lows God has brought them through. Applied generosity is really about giving some language and structure to what that journey actually looks like. I think there are so many out there who are at many different phases of that journey, whether just starting out or, deep into the generosity decades in. And I think there's so much left to explore. But, as somebody who's been in generosity for at least some time myself, it's easy to kind of plateau. And once you see the whole landscape, I think it really opens up new whole entire realms to explore in generosity. And I think God is constantly working in us and inviting us into that. That is our real hope with the Applied Generosity podcast, is to unlock some of those doors for givers everywhere.
Yeah, I'll just say You guys probably started first sharing some of this stuff with us as a board a good year ago or more. And it's really been fun to see now these like really well fleshed out 7 areas, those same 7 we talked about earlier. And for you guys to have some material to take us deeper into each of those 7. And I'm really excited to start at the beginning and dig in on each of those. And for me, I'm really excited that it'll open up areas that I've spent less time thinking about and be able to dig in and go deeper.
Yeah, similar to what Matt just said, really excited for this Applied Generosity podcast and resource. Again, we have loved the stories that you all have shared on the Finish Line Pledge podcast, over 160, and Matt and I are just humbled by the fact that we got to be one of your guests on the Finish Line podcast. But this takes it, I think, to the next level, and doing this in community with others of, how does this practically play out, right? The stories are just inspiring and encouraging, and we can get ideas, but then this, I think, is going to take us to that next step and that next level of, and just growing deeper in this space of how do we live the generous life? How do we just keep getting better at applying it day in and day out? And it's a journey that we'll be on until Jesus returns or until he calls each of us home. And I'm excited to be on it with you guys and with Heather and with so many other folks in the generosity space and in financial stewardship space who just want to, at the end of the day, we each want to hear those precious words from our Savior. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into your master's happiness.
Well, it has been so much fun just getting to sit in the seats that we get to sit in as hosts of this podcast and to humbly learn from the many, many givers who have gone before us and just trying to piece together the experience that they have earned, often through very challenging steps of faith in order to get to where they are. And our hope is just that this podcast starts to bridge together some of that journey for others who are continuing to follow in their footsteps.
And over the past year, we've had dozens of leaders in the generosity space contribute feedback and share their stories to help make Applied Generosity what it is today. We cannot wait for you to dive in. We know that God's got an incredible journey for you as you explore more of the generous life. Matt, David, thank you so much for coming and spending some time with us. Always a pleasure to see you guys and hear more of your stories.
Great to be with you guys. Super fun.
Great to be with you guys. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show, guys. If you want to find any references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 173. If you want to learn more about Applied Generosity, check out the Applied Generosity podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, or check us out at appliedgenerosity.com. That's all we have for today. We'll see you next time.